Okay, welcome to everyone out there who are our faithful Apatic viewers. I'm back yet another month here with a very exciting guest. Brad Ovenell-Carter is going to dazzle and impress us this month with what I like to call some wizardry in the classroom and in education in general. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but of course it's going to having to do with apps and using them to redefine education. So Brad, I'm so glad you're able to join us and share what's going to be a very special webcast episode here on Apatic.
Well, thanks for the invitation. This is exciting. I like this kind of thing, and I'm honored and flattered to be called in to talk to your folks today. So do we want to just get started then? Yeah. Okay. So what we've got, we're talking about apps, but I think what's really important is we put that into context. I do a lot of professional development. That's my main role here at the school. I work at Mulgrave School, which is a K-12 independent school in Vancouver. But I get around into a fair number of other schools, and we're out at conferences and that kind of thing. And usually the first question you get asked is, when you pull out your phone or your iPad or something, what apps do you have? Which is, it's always interesting to see what people are playing with, and it kind of shortcuts the process of digging around for them. But, I think enough of us know it's not really about the app, it's what do you do with it. And I think, with my students and I, we're pushing like beyond what do you do with it, what's the context for all of that, what's the bigger picture that we're trying to achieve with these apps, because I think what we're getting out of them is potentially some huge leverage into whatever we want to call it, new education, education 3.0 or whatever. So I'm going to switch to a slide deck, and I'm going to talk you through kind of some of the context for new learning, or again, whatever we're going to call it. Look at a methodology my students and I are developing, which kind of mashes up a whole bunch of services and apps and that kind of thing. And then take a look at some practical applications. What do you do with that stuff? How do you roll this out? A school like mine, it's a very well-off school. We're an Ivy League prep school kind of thing. But there are lots of other schools that don't have the resources that we do. So what do you do when everybody's talking about apps and you don't have a one-to-one thing? You've got a couple of devices. How do you handle that? And give the viewers some ideas of what do we do with almost no technology. In fact, you can get away with one single device, as I'll show you in a classroom, and I think provide very effective teaching. So I'm just going to switch to my desktop, and then we'll run through a slide deck for, I don't know, 20 or 30 minutes or something like that, and then get to some Q&A or whatever we want to do to wrap up. So here we go. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see the desktop now, and there we go. So
no, we're not seeing anything yet, Brad.
Okay, just let me take a look here. Let me try one more time. Okay, we good now?
Give it 1 second.
Yep.
We're seeing. There we go. Yes.
Okay. All right. So just to confirm, you guys are seeing the single little book up there in the top left of the screen?
Yes, we are.
Good.
And we're
Okay.
hearing you perfectly.
Good. Okay, so this starts with the idea of predominantly the textbook, but books in general. Socrates knew that a book cemented knowledge. He didn't like books himself. In fact, he never wrote down a word. Everything we know about Socrates comes from his pupil Plato. And don't get me wrong, I think books are fabulous. I have a big library at home. I've got a growing collection of rare books and that sort of thing. And if we look at a novel, it's one of the great artistic achievements of humanity, I think. But it does cement knowledge. Once it's in there, it doesn't move. And it's symbolic of a particular way of thinking. And it generates a kind of passive consumption of knowledge. When we read a book, we do talk to our students about having a dialogue with the author. But really, it's about consuming this information that somebody else has said is important in some way. So it creates a kind of one-way communication, which is fine. It's good for communicating, well, let's call it trivial data, information that you can look up. It's good for just sort of a straight-up storytelling and that kind of thing. But it is about this passive engagement from our students and from anybody else who's consuming knowledge out of books or websites, for that matter. Excuse me. And they're built for one kind of pedagogy, and that's that one-to-many delivery, really. In fact, lectures were born out of the fact that there were very few books. And you would travel great distances to sit in a lecture hall somewhere, and somebody would essentially read the book, and you would copy down as much as you could, because books were so rare and so expensive to build. In fact, a really big library in, say, the 5th or 6th century might have 150 books in it. Compared to now, with the Library of Congress after the invention of the printing press, the Library of Congress has about 142 million unique titles. But even that is built up around this idea that information is scarce, it's packed up in books, it's very precious, and we need one person to tell us what's important. And our schools built up around that model. We have, we still walk into schools where desks are essentially into rows or groups, or at least there's a teacher station at the front or in the corner with everything. The axis of instruction hasn't moved for over 1,000 years, I think. So this is what John Seeley Brown, who was originally out of the Palo Alto Research Center, and now runs his own sort of think tank, I guess. His business card is the best business card on the planet. It says Chief of Chaos, I think is what his job title is. But anyhow, this is built on this idea that he calls a Cartesian model, where we see knowledge almost as a concrete object, and even our language reflects that kind of thing. I would say to you, let me give you a piece of advice, as if I was saying, let me give you the keys to my car, or let me give you a book to read, or something like that. Or I have something that you might be interested in knowing. And it's very interesting because it gets back to this pedagogy where teachers are gatekeepers. When you do certain things, I will give you some more knowledge. When you reach a certain age, for example, I will give you some more knowledge. Generally, that's the way it works in our schools. If kids are really moving along fast, they're kind of stuck in this grade system we have. Or if you behave well and you study hard and you write an exam and you do well, I'll give you some more knowledge. But there is this control over access and this passivity that comes out of it, because I have to wait for somebody else to give me the knowledge. In contrast, there is this other way of building knowledge, where we talk about knowledge being socially constructed. And this is, in fact, a very ancient way. There's a Danish professor, I can't remember his name off the top of my head here, but he's come up with this idea. He calls it the Gutenberg parenthesis. And his argument is that we can look at the invention of the printing press and the ability to produce many, many books very rapidly as merely interrupting the oral tradition, and that we may soon look back on this period from the invention of the printing press to now, that one, in his words, that is curiously dominated by print. That is, there's no reason to say print is the ultimate way of expressing ourselves. In fact, we can think of really, print was the first medium that allowed us to get thoughts out of my head and into yours, Mike, over time and distance in a convenient way. So I could write a letter and roll it up and tie it up and give it to a guy on horseback, and he could go charging across the country, and a couple of weeks later you'd get that letter and you'd open it up and you'd read to yourself and understand what was in my head. But today we don't have to rely on that kind of technology anymore. It's in fact easier, as we're doing here, to capture the screencast here in a Hangout and upload that to YouTube. If you were trying to transcribe everything that went on here in the next 20 minutes or so, it would take you ages. It's much faster to create and share knowledge through video these days, for example. So this social model works very differently. When we look at the Cartesian model, learning is a kind of mass production with everybody doing the same thing at the same time. And like I said a little while ago, that's really good when you're pushing out kind of trivial information, or when you need to move everybody through the same kind of locksteps, say a set of instructions on how to operate a machine. And this reflects the invention of public education, which was intended to create broad literacy as rapidly as possible. And in that, it was brilliantly successful. In the late 19th century, the illiteracy rate in the United States, and we'll assume for all of North America, was about 25%, which meant a quarter of the population couldn't read or write in any language whatsoever. And by the 60s, 70s, that goes down to about 0.5%. So public education was brilliantly successful, wildly successful, and we need to stop bashing it. and give it this marvelous retirement party or something like that. But it's not up to the task of what we're asking it to do, which is create that sort of innovative, creative, entrepreneurial kind of culture. And the founders of public education were perfectly aware of that. They explicitly said, look, public education is not going to be about creating that innovative group. It's about creating everybody and getting them ready for the industrial workplace. That was the explicit purpose. But that's changing now. And my argument is that I think we can go back to this social model, which is 600 or 700 years old, and pull a lot out of it, add a bunch of modern technology to it, in particular social media and the apps that go with it, and create a new kind of learning. So what we get out of this is learning now becomes a collaborative project with everybody doing different tasks. In my classroom, I teach a theory of knowledge class, which is part of the International Baccalaureate program. I divide up the student responsibilities, so nobody's doing the same thing. I'll have each class 1 or 2 students be the official note takers. And this is all based on work that Alan November did. He called it the digital learning farm, and where on a farm everybody has a job and everybody pulls his or her own weight and the farm thrives. And we've played around with some of these roles. So I will have a couple of students be note takers, a couple of students be official researchers. They're kids who will have their laptop or phones open or whatever, and anytime we run into something that we don't know, they'll look it up on the fly. And we have tutorial designers. If we run into a regular problem, I'll assign them to create a little tutorial that we can go back to and we put it on our website and so forth. But it's a very different approach. We don't expect everybody to be doing the same thing at the same time. And in fact, what happens is the room becomes smarter. If you divide up the work, the room can do more than any one individual can. I can do a lot. I was a capable student. But my group of students are now learning more than any one of them could. And there's some other very powerful things that come out of this, aside from the individual learning part of it. The learning as mass production creates a kind of psychology, one of isolation. Our buildings are, brick and mortar things with closed doors, closed classrooms. If you walk into a typical school in the middle of class time, between the bells, the halls are almost empty. There's a little window on the door in typical buildings anyways. And we all work in these little rooms and nothing is shared. I'm working at my desk, and you'll watch. I did an experiment with some students once where I challenged them to write an essay, and I divided the class into 2 groups. And I gave both groups the same essay topic. The passing mark was going to be 90%. If it fell below that, you were going to fail. And each group had to produce 1 essay. The condition was you can do anything you need to do to write the perfect essay. And they both failed because they fell into this intense competition where they wouldn't share information. Had they collaborated with each other and both groups submitted the same essay that they had all worked on, it would have been fine. But I said it so it was almost impossible for any one person to write. But they all sat down at their desks and they were fiercely competitive because they're not used to collaborating. The other part is control. I talked about a little bit before that you have to wait for people to give you the information. And it might be that they're giving you information you don't really need because you already know it, but it renders you kind of helpless in this situation. And part of that is this dependency. I can't move on until somebody else gives me the information I need. So when we complain that our students are passive, they're not very engaged, I think that's not so much the fault of say, our teachers or what's going on in a classroom, but much bigger structures that go all the way back, probably with this idea of building our schools around a book, a single book, which was very rare. And as I said, we have to develop this lecture thing, and we've got somebody who controls that access to that book. In contrast, when we work with collaborative learning, we build community, where we need each other to be at the table. I need those really good note takers, and I need those really good tutorial designers, and I depend on them because I can't do that as well as some of these note takers. And it builds trust. So I'm trusting those note takers to do a good job, and I'm trusting everybody else to show up when they will. And finally, it builds capacity. The group starts investigating problems that it's interested in. Instead of waiting for me to tell it what it needs to do, they're building this capacity to learn and to ask questions. So this is a general framework. I think we're seeing this shift from a Cartesian model to a socially constructed model, or not so much a shift, but a return to it, but amplified by technology. So I want to take a look at how we might actually build that in our classrooms and what a workflow might be. So this is what my students and I are working on. And we start with this idea of baseline literacy. And that's the idea that every subject has a grammar. There's some things you just got to know. And the Cartesian model works very well for that. If I need you to learn your multiplication tables for math, which is a great skill, it allows you to, later on when you're factoring binomials and things like that, or polynomials, it's easier if you've got your multiplication table in your head. It can be very exotic. A couple of years back, I was head of a school called Think Global School. This is a global mobile high school. There's no building anywhere on the planet for it. And we would just fly students and faculty into 3 different cities each year. And when we were in Sydney, we knew we wanted to take the kids out to the Great Barrier Reef to do some diving. But before we could do that, we had to teach them how to scuba dive, which we did in Sydney Harbor where we were staying. And so there was a bunch of skill development. Here's how you scuba dive, because we're going to be working with a marine biologist later on and asking some very complex questions. So that baseline literacy could be, the 8 parts of speech in an English class. It could be your math times table. It could be a fairly sophisticated skill like scuba diving. But there's some stuff that we just teach, and it's kind of a one-to-many, here's how you do it. And that's going to equip the kids to get out and do some field work. And this is the critical space, I think. In fact, we're calling this the field school model, and it borrows a lot from some of the tools that ethnographers use. But if we're going to think of the end game in education as to send students out there to make sense out of the world, I think we have to put them in the world and equip them to start asking the questions that allow them to get to the question, what the heck's going on out here? So you need some baseline skills. The field work is an example, again, that Sydney Harbor. One of the things we did was to take part in a longitudinal study that the University of Sydney was doing, and that was measuring the health of Sydney Harbor. And one way you do that is to count the sea urchin population. Sea urchins are kind of a canary species for the harbor. And so we taught the kids to scuba dive, we taught them some basic math statistics, and taught them how to lay underwater transit lines so they could do an underwater survey of the sea urchin population on the seafloor in Sydney Harbor. So they're out there doing, real field work. This data goes into a big database that University of Sydney is working on. So we had to give them that baseline literacy so they could go out and actually capture and curate some information. And here's the critical step. Right now, I think we're talking about teachers as being curators, no longer sage on the stage, but we're helping to filter knowledge and pass it on to the kids. The problem with that is I'm still the gatekeeper if I'm the curator. I'm telling kids this is what's important. And that's kind of the way universities work. A professor will pull a bunch of different resources together, these textbooks, these lectures, maybe this artwork, and curate a course for the students. But it's still the professor telling the students what's important and what's not. What I want to do is equip the students with the skills to go out and evaluate for themselves what's important and what's not. So if you think of that experience you have when you first go to a new city, you're traveling, maybe you're going to a conference, you're on vacation, and you're driving through a new city, how overwhelming that is. Everything is new to you, and you have no way of knowing what's important and what's not. And it takes several days to begin to filter out the stuff that is of no consequence and the stuff that's really important. Your route from your hotel to the museum or to the restaurant or where you park your car or all of those kinds of things. It takes time, but as adults we have the skills to begin to identify those things. We learn how to ask people, we learn how to look at what other people are doing. But I don't think we really explicitly teach our students to do that. And here's where the technology comes in. If our students have something like a mobile phone, they can walk out into the world, into the field, and capture data in so many different ways. We can take video, we can do voice, we can type text, we can share that with everybody on social media, and so forth. And incidentally, that field work doesn't necessarily literally mean going out into the field. We would take that to mean reading a book. It's the first time you've encountered it. Everything in that book is equally important. You haven't, evaluated what are the key things, what are the key turns in the plot, is this a major character or a minor character? You have to figure out how that goes. So this is what we want to have kids do, is learn the questions to be their own curators of knowledge. And we want them to stay in the question. We don't need to move to that answer so fast. So much of what we do in our schools drives towards an answer. which is a reflection of staying in that Cartesian model. Important work, but I think we have to move beyond that. And what we want to do is get these kids to become problem finders. If we think of the first generation of public education as problem solving 1.0, that is, go to page 10, answer questions 1 and 2, parts A, B, and C for Thursday. That was the first kind of problem solving we did. The sort of second generation might be called problem-based learning. And that's where we would give kids some kind of challenge, and with the belief they'd be motivated to do all that baseline literacy studying in order to be able to solve the problem. But the problem with that problem is it's not really a problem because I already know the answer. I've artificially constructed that problem. What I want kids to do is go out and find problems that nobody knows the answer to. And there are not a lot of them like that, but there are. And they can be big or small problems. And this is where we get out into the real world, and we're extending this skill we have. We've gone out, we've made observations in the field, we've gathered up all this data, we've used our digital tools to capture and catalog and curate this knowledge. And then we want to sit down and say, what's important? What do we make of this? It might be that we go, well, it's kind of inconsequential information. There was nothing really that interesting here. Fun, but there aren't any real problems. But maybe a problem does evolve, and then we want to see if we can solve it. And those problems can be very small. It could be, you know, as a grade 3 teacher, I'm having a hard time getting this year's class of kids to understand fractions or something. And so I want to engage maybe my grade 8 students to help me solve that very real-world problem. I didn't last year. My grade 3 kids got it very quickly. But this year we're struggling with it. Or it could be a much bigger problem, like the health of Sydney Harbour. So we go out, teach the kids baseline literacy, give them experience curating and capturing knowledge, and teach them how to ask good questions that help them identify problems. And we get them to create these legacy projects, these real-world problems that have value to somebody other than the students themselves or the teacher. I think, you know, there are only 2 times in our lives where we are deprived of civil liberty. And one is when you break the law and are convicted and go to jail. And the second time is when you go to school. You have no choice. We oblige you by law to go to school, which puts a heavy moral burden on us as teachers to make the kids do something worthwhile with that time when we're stealing it from them. So I think we have to engage them in something that's very real. So, whoops, let's go forward again. I think this process is iterative. We will do the field work, we come up with what we think is a problem, then we try to solve the problem, and we might discover we don't have enough information. We have to come back to the field and dig around for some more data. Maybe we have to go back to chapter 4 of the novel and reread it or something like that. So there's this kind of loop going on here, and it's based on socially constructed knowledge. It means that there has to be a tremendous amount of dialogue. In fact, in social model, if there is no dialogue, there is no knowledge construction. You can't have passive knowledge going somewhere. We have to discuss it. We have to ask questions. Is this important to us? If we're not sure if it's important, is somebody who can tell us that this is going to be important to us? One of the practices we developed when I was with Think Global School was when we went to a museum or a gallery or anything like that, we would say we want the tour, but at the end of the tour we would like 30 minutes with your tour guide or the docent or whomever, so that we could sit down, show everybody the pictures we took, the notes we took, and ask, is there anything we missed? Is there something important we should know? If we have a question and you can't answer it, who can answer it for us? So we not only want to capture the knowledge, but we want to capture a bit of a sense of our knowledge about it, or how sure we are of it. So it becomes a very different experience where the students are really engaged. And I think as teachers we have to have the guts. If the teachers say, we already know this, we don't need to worry about it, and we believe them, then we can discard it in this project. So this is the quick summary of it. The lessons in the baseline literacy prepare us for field work that equip us to solve these real-world, or find and solve these real-world problems. Here's where the apps kind of thing come in on it, or the technology. Below this line, this baseline literacy is teacher-driven. Above that, which is the bulk of the work, is student-driven. And this capture and curate stuff relies on mobile tools. We want to have something with us that gives us the ability to quickly and accurately capture and catalog the data, but also connect to people who can help us identify it and tell us whether it's important. So that's the mobile phone. I get asked all the time, which, of the 3 devices you see on my desk, an iPad, a MacBook Air, and my iPhone. If you could get one device into kids' hands, which one would it be? And hands down, without hesitation, it would be a mobile phone. I'd throw out my iPad, I'd throw out my Mac Air. If I could only give every kid a mobile phone, I think this would change education. The laptop is built on a typewriter form, and it's built on typewriter thinking. The thing that makes a laptop great is the web, but the thing that makes the web itself great is a mobile phone. So we need that device that allows us to be anywhere and capture the data. One of the last year, Leonard Cohen was in Vancouver singing. And he's also an artist, and he had an art show on. And on a Saturday evening, one of my students was at the art show, took out his phone, snapped a picture on Instagram, used a hashtag we use for our class, and sent it to us. So he wasn't in class, but he was clearly showing he was thinking about theory of knowledge. He captured the data, cataloged it, and labeled it with a hashtag at like 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. So now I know learning is happening all the time. And he was asking questions. Does this connect to our class discussion last Thursday? That's what I want to see happen. Two other parts of what's going on here is this practice of visualization and storytelling. These are ancient skills. Visualization is what we do when we've got this data and we start mapping it out, and we try to make a picture of what's going on. We do, data visualization, infographics is the big thing now. But again, it's a very old idea. If you think of the paintings on the caves at Lascaux, that's visualization, trying to make sense using pictures. We learn via pictures first. And one of the issues I have with our heavy text-based culture is that it's not as, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And we've dropped our visualization. We learned to draw long before we learned to write. And yet we drum that drawing out of kids. So by the time we get to high school, ultimately everything comes down to a written report, unless you're in the visual arts, generally speaking. And from that visualization, we start to construct stories. That's the sense-making that we do. We've got this data, we've tried to solve this problem, and then we ask ourselves, what does it mean? I was in Geneva a couple of years back at an Apple conference. The keynote speaker was a guy named Rolf Landau, who's the head of education at CERN. And he said, here we are at CERN. We were literally sitting on top of the big cyclotron. And he said, we're sitting on top of the world's most advanced laboratory. It took the planet to come together and build this thing. It was so sophisticated and so expensive. And we have the best minds from every single country on the planet working here. And he said, and all we're doing at CERN is storytelling. We're trying to come up with a story for the origin of the universe. He said, grade 4 kids can do what we can do here. He said, yes, they need some specialized language in math and physics, but essentially we're just coming up with a story of the creation of the universe. And what they did was that field work. They're going out, smashing subatomic particles together, gathering the data, asking themselves what's important, what do we make of this, drawing pictures of that, and then trying to make sense of it in a story. All very ancient skills that are coming back. But have been, disguised over the last couple of 100 years by our focus on text, I think. So the last part of this, once we've done our visualization and our storytelling, is we game it in some sense, and gamification is coming up. But what happens in gaming is we go from the story to imagining future possibilities. We go, what if? And then we test out the what if. It's kind of like, let's see what happens if I open this door, or what happens if I make a jump across this gap in the game. Metaphorically, that's the same as what happens. We create our story of the universe or of the sea urchin population in Sydney Harbor, and then we start asking these what if things. Those are all very ancient skills, but we're seeing them come back through the various apps that we use and the devices that we have. So this is a framework, a model that my students and I have been developing. And so I just want to talk you through a couple of examples of how this might work in our classes. And this idea, I've talked about that it is very social. So one way you can do this is, at my school, we're very fortunate. We come from a wealthy community. I teach in West Van, which is the richest neighborhood in the country, but 15-minute drive from here in the downtown east side of Vancouver is the poorest neighborhood in the country. And we know that we all have colleagues who work in every kind of school between the sort of place I work and a downtown east side school. And so what do you do if you have very limited technology? I ran this experiment where I had an old mobile phone that had just been kicking around in the drawer. But it had a camera on it. So I grabbed a stand from the chemistry department and clamped the phone to it, put it out in the hallway with a sign on it and a little box underneath it. And in the box was just a blank white canvas, basically. And beside that was a box of little black squares of different sizes. And the instructions said, take 2 black squares and arrange them on that white canvas in a way that activates the white space or the negative space. This was for an art project on negative space. Take a picture. And in 24 hours, my students had created about 30 or 40 of pictures that looked like this. So that was using a single device to do a bunch of data capture. And then we could go into the art class, put these up, and we can have a discussion. Instead of going to a textbook, the students have created this content. And you can look at them and you can say we have to throw out a couple because they broke the rule. They have more than 2 boxes. Although the one sort of, you know, row 2, column B kind of thing is quite interesting. The white space is quite active there. But they did this on their own with minimal instruction, and now we've got our own content. The students are invested in this. The students look at this and they recognize that, you know, that's mine. Did I do a good job of activating negative space? But other things happen too. You get these sort of goofy outliers and you have to throw them out. But who cares? Because one of the things that happens when I'm doing this is when you give the room for the kids to play and experiment and sort of try to create and curate knowledge themselves, they do something that just blows your mind every time. One of the students did this. They took 2 of the squares, bent them, and put them on edge, so they suddenly created 3-dimensional negative space, plus added the shadow thing. So on their own, they extended our conversation way beyond 2-dimensional space and kind of rounded that out. Had we been working from a textbook on 2-dimensional space, we wouldn't have talked about 3-dimensional space because the textbook would have cemented that discussion at 2 dimensions. So that's kind of an in-between amount of technology. I just want to talk generally about other ways of doing it. My TOK class and I use a heavy amount of technology. We use a mix-up of Twitter. So my students and I tweet our classes all the time. That's our official note-taking tool is Twitter. If you have anything important to say, you tweet it, stick the hashtag on it. Then we use a bit of Google Script, which automatically once an hour fires and pulls the tweets down into a Google spreadsheet, because we all know tweets disappear from the Twitter stream after a couple of weeks. Then what we do is periodically we go and we mine that spreadsheet, and they're huge. The kids have sent, first year they sent over 12,000 tweets. In fact, we blew up a Google spreadsheet. The script that pulls in grabs a lot of metadata, and we actually, as Google spreadsheet will contain 440,000 cells of data, and we actually had to make a second spreadsheet because we filled it up so quickly.
Brad, let me interrupt you. We're not seeing you or
oh, okay.
What we're supposed to see on screen here, I think.
Okay, yeah. So I just shifted off screen. Yep. Just let me try here. Let's see. Are you seeing me now?
We're seeing you. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to switch back to the to my desktop here. Hang on. There we go. If you got the desktop back?
Not yet.
Let's try one more time. Sorry?
No worries.
How we doing?
I think we're getting there. Yes. Now we got to switch. We're seeing your desktop. Yes.
Good. Okay. Let me get to Chrome. Sorry, we're having a few technical difficulties. Well, while I'm doing this, I'll keep talking about it. So what we do is we've got we're tweeting out, and then this script once an hour fires and grabs anything that's got the hashtag that we're interested in. Once we've done that, periodically we will have the students go through and mine that spreadsheet. I'm just going to grab the spreadsheet for you here, show you what it looks like. And we'll go through and we'll look at that those tweets we've sent. And this is where we do the curation process. As the students go through, we'll look and we say, you know, if 3 or 4 people tweeted more or less the same thing, for some reason that's important to this group this year. We need to pay attention to it. So here's this year's so far. You can see that we're down to 785 tweets. This is our second spreadsheet. So this is over the last couple of months. So we have this archiving tool, and it turns out the Twitter thing is becoming very powerful. I think we don't really fully appreciate how powerful Twitter is for education. It's so fast to gather the data, and I think reducing the friction when we're using our tools is super important. If it's awkward to go and capture something, we're not likely to do it. But as that student did at the art show with Leonard Cohen, he just could pull out his phone, grab a quick snap, and Instagram it or tweet it. These low barrier to entry kinds of tools are very powerful. Once we've gone through in our mind, we've mined our data, we use Storify. And there's a great Storify app, and it connects with a whole bunch of other tools. And this is the result of what the students have pulled together. They've gone through that spreadsheet, they've found the links that people have tweeted out, they pulled it all into Storify, added embedded videos that were referred to in those tweets. And we've now come up with essentially a chapter that the students themselves have built. We haven't really studied this knowledge yet. We've had conversations. This is our field work. We've grabbed stuff that we think is important for some reason. Once we've done that part, then we take that over to something called Thinglink, which is a web service, but again, there's a killer little app for the iPad and iPhone for this. One of my students, this is one of my tutorial designers, is a sketch note drawer. And she, during the course of our discussions, will create these sketch notes. And then afterwards, we get the other students to annotate the image. Now, Thinglink is a service that allows you to put these hyperlinks on an image. So you upload a JPEG or a PNG file, and you can just drop these little markers on it. And those markers can contain hyperlinks to anything we want. This one here contains the hyperlink to that Storify. So now what we have is a high-level abstract done as pictures. So we're moving to that visualization kind of thing, with the detailed discussion hidden underneath it. And then we add these extra things. This was our look at Brecht's play Galileo. So we're talking about heliocentrism and so forth. So they add a Wikipedia entry. Here we're talking about Dante's Inferno and the map of heaven, earth, and hell. We add clips to music of the spheres, because that was the old belief that there were crystal spheres surrounding the Earth. So this is a great exotic mashup of everything from Twitter and Storify and hashtags and all the rest of it. If we look at that single camera in the hallway with an old phone as the middle ground, this is kind of the upper end of really going crazy with technology. But then the other part is, what do you do if you have almost none? And I think one of the other really exciting things about what's happening with this shift to socially constructed knowledge and a return to an oral tradition is that it supports a kind of analog work. In fact, we're finding that our students are working more and more in this analog-digital hybrid. Increasingly, they'll step up to the whiteboard and start drawing on the whiteboard during class, and there's no invitation. They don't need one. If somebody feels like drawing, they just get up and draw. Or they draw on a piece of paper, and then they take a picture of it, hashtag it with our hashtag for the class, and tweet the thing out, and we've captured this analog content. So I'm just going to switch back to the camera, and I've got this big map that my students and I did, which is just purely analog, to show you what can be done without any technology at all, to do this sort of fieldwork study. So are we back? Can you see me now again? Okay.
Yep.
So one of the things in the theory of knowledge class is the IB gave us a new guide, which said, they told us that we should now think of knowledge as a map. So I went to my students and said, IB says we should think of knowledge as a map. And I said, so I'm not sure if that's true, just because they said so. Here's our question. Is it true? I don't know. Let's make a map. And the kids said, well, what does that look like, Mr. O.C.? And I said, I haven't the foggiest idea. Let's find out. So we went up to the library and asked for a bunch of old atlases, and we grabbed big stacks of paper and markers and scissors and glue and went back to kindergarten. In fact, these are grade 11 students. One of them, when we were making this map, said, I haven't had this much fun learning since I was in kindergarten. And it's interesting, I think, because we were returning to that visual, expressive, get on your belly and draw kind of thing. So let's see if I've got a photo here. Well, here, I'll just show you the map here. I'm going to have to unplug for a second. But so this is, I don't know if you guys can see that, but this is just a big map metaphor. So the map is just a big metaphor for knowledge, and the whole process was very hands-on. We put a bit of music in the room, we put all the tables together, and the kids are literally lying on the table drawing like they were doing in kindergarten. But what would happen was they'd cut out some bits of maps and glue them onto shapes and said, we think this represents the areas of knowledge. And then we would test that to see if, we would look at a real world situation and say, does this accurately reflect? And the map became more and more complex as we went on. So we've built this map and we're now just done. I mean, that's totally analog. There's no technology other than a photo. So if as a teacher you've got a digital camera, you can have the kids make an analog item and take a photo and put it on a website that you can build and share that with whomever then. And we're now testing out this map. We're sending kids out into our classes, observing an English class or a physics class, looking at how knowledge moves around and coming back to see if the map will accurately reflect that knowledge. So that's kind of the, in a real fly-through, kind of a big picture and some ideas of how we might actually roll this out. That's kind of the end of the presentation, I suppose. And if we've got some questions or so forth, I'd love to get some feedback on this. I mean, we're really excited about this project.
Yeah, I'm just blown away. I mean, this is really interesting. I think you segue nicely into how we have traditionally done a lot of things, and I love how you've blended a lot of the technology tools and social media and the things that we're exposed to, and we want to see more into education with a lot of traditional sources and skills of information. I mean, I think knowledge transfer, information transfer is still key in education. I think you've really provided some interesting tools, concepts, ideas. I'm really excited about it. I mean, I look at a lot of things that I do with my own students and try to think literally outside the box. And I don't know, I think some of the work you're doing here with some of your students is fantastic. And I love, just the way you shared this presentation was interesting. I mean, I've seen you speak before, Brad, and I know that, your method of using sketch notes, visual notes to not only capture ideas but share them is phenomenal. I mean, I guess from that viewpoint, if I can distill it down, I think your whole framework here is awesome and can go in a million directions. But if we look at your presentation style of what you've done here, and I know that sharing with pictures, like you said, has been done for thousands of years. What tools, apps, and what kind of has brought you to communicate in this style with visual notes and sketch notes?
Yeah, there's an interesting process, and in a sense, it doesn't matter what tools you use, but I think this is a good model for how, in particular, the iPad and the apps that are available dramatically change the way I think and work. So you can swap out whatever tool. My favorite tool by far, and I just think it's a brilliant app, is Paper by the company 53. I've played around with a lot of drawing apps, and this just, for me, hits the sweet spot. I played around. Adobe Ideas is a fantastic tool, but I found the drawing tools just a little bit too simple, not expressive enough. And then there's some super high-end apps that are meant for professional graphic designers, and they were great, but the tool set was so complex, by the time I drilled down to the tool I wanted, I forgot what I was going to write down anyways. So Paper has this, it's just that sweet spot. In fact, I met the engineers and the developers and the founder, a guy named George Pechnik, and I said, so what does 53 mean? What the company title? And he said, 53 is the average distance in centimeters from your brain to your hand when you're sitting at a desk. And his whole mission is to get ideas out of your head, down into a format that feels as organic and natural as possible, but still takes advantage of digital technologies. So that using a digital tool for that was important. I keep notebooks. I still use Paper a lot. I mean, here's a sketchbook, and I'm working like this. And I used to go to conferences and I'd be sketching on paper, and people beside me would say, "Hey, can I have your notes?" And I would go, "I don't know if they're going to make sense to you, but you can have them." And then I was taking a picture of them and tweeting it or emailing it. And then this app came along, 53's Paper, and I said, well, you know what? I can skip all of that extra photo stuff, just start drawing and sharing them with them. And then more and more people started to ask for the notes, and I said, you know what? I'm just going to have the guts to just, instead of sending it to individuals on request, when I go to a conference, I'm just going to start tweeting my notes, kind of live, partway through. Here's what I've got so far of a keynote, and it was scary, right? Because you all of a sudden you're putting your work out there, and then I thought that was the key thing. And if we can get our students and ourselves as teachers to get rid of the internal editor and start working out in the open, being this sort of radically transparent kind of thinking, all kinds of stuff happens. People look at your notes, and I put them out without apology. Don't ask me to explain them because I don't have time, right? They're mine, they work for me. But people are going, but putting them out there made me think I've got to be a little bit more clear in my thinking. Because people will ask, and sort of as a favor, I don't, maybe I can help somebody else understand. And if they understand what I'm thinking, my hope is that they'll call me up and challenge me on that stuff. If we can't make sense of my notes, I'm never going to be challenged. If I make a clear statement that challenges somebody's thinking, they're going to push back, and that's where learning happens. That's that social dialogue. So having the digital tool to push my content out there and invite the feedback was a huge change. Like, I never set out to be a sketchnote guy, but you just start doing it, and somebody saw this stuff. I was sketchnoting at an Apple conference last summer, and in the middle of the conference, I got a call from 53, and they said, we'd love you to come and talk to our engineers and developers because we like the way you use the tool. And then some other people saw some stuff, and now I'm working on a book. And that wasn't my intention to do that, but things happen when you push that out there. So the question I have is, what happens for us and our students if we get them using digital tools and share that stuff on social media to begin that socially constructed knowledge dialogue, start sharing, who knows what happens. It's that network that really matters. We're starting to have a conversation at my school. One conversation we have with all our students is, what do you know when you graduate? And that's what final exams are about, and report cards or stuff. But we're thinking that maybe the other question we need to ask is, who do you know? Who is going to help you when you run into a problem that you don't know the answer to? What's your network? So that means as schools we have to start helping kids build networks, and the way we do that is to put our own work out there. And it's interesting because it makes teaching a creative profession again. I'm not just the delivery person taking packaged content and pushing that through. I get that. I have trust in the system that the state or the province or the Fed is, has good intentions and is packaging up curricula that has value. But I think our job as teachers is to add much more to that and to take what we've got and create something new. And it's these digital tools, and most importantly, inviting students into the process and giving them the digital tools to help co-create knowledge that really makes education exciting. I've never taught my subject the same way twice because, the students are different every time, and we have to invite them in that process. So, look for these tools. And the key thing is to use the tools in combination. People get focused on a single app, and that's great because there's some very powerful tools. And I love paper, for example. But one of the reasons I love it is I can quickly push it to my Tumblr account or to the photo, to my album, and then I can share it somewhere else because it's connected at the back end of it. And that mashup we have of Twitter, Google Scripts, Thinglink, Storify, all of it playing out on an iPad. So start to look at how these tools play in combination, because the great thing about the iPad or the iOS environment is the device is fantastic, but I think the thing that really makes it go is the app development environment. It's like the iTunes thing. iTunes is great, but the thing that really makes iTunes powerful is the music selling part. It's about buying a tune for 99 cents. It's not about the device that came out. And I think if we start to look at this the same way, that we have this incredible development of apps, each one of these apps does something very narrow but particularly well. So like Thinglink is great for adding hyperlinks to a photo. You're not going to write an essay on Thinglink, right? You can take a bunch of pictures of it, but that's not what it's for. But there are some great writing apps. So what happens if we pull all of this stuff together and look at the web as the tool that holds it together, as the glue? And I think it's going to be something like Twitter with a hashtag. I can do a Thinglink, tweet it with the hashtag for our class. I can write a blog post and then tweet that out with a hashtag for the class, and all of that stuff gets pulled together. So now we have a coherent story. But it's the mashup of this kind of stuff. And I think the mashup actually is a metaphor for dialogue, or for this social constructed thing. I'm talking over here, I'm talking over there, and we pull all that stuff together. And when we look at it all, that's where learning starts to happen.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Brad, this has just been phenomenal. You provided a lot for people to think about, and a lot of tools. I love the concepts. And one of the things that I've loved doing here on these webcasts is always providing people with different ways, different entry points of, you have these devices, you have apps as a framework to kind of use these devices, and you've elevated that. In new directions, I think, with a lot of the ways you're trying to reach out to your students and push that in education. So I'm so glad we had you on. And, of course, your page is available on Appetik, and we'll have this posted on YouTube immediately. And then this will be embedded in the blog. So we'll have all of your contact information there so people can tweet you and everything else, and hopefully you can be as responsive as possible with your schedule and everything else to keep the dialogue going.
Yeah, I hope so, because it is about the dialogue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me in, and thanks for allowing me to share, because like I said, this is where we find out. I mean, we all cook up our ideas in our classrooms, and you go, okay, it kind of works here, but what happens if we try to scale it up and spread it out to other people? So the feedback is more than, questions are more than welcome. So thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely, and we'll touch base here after the show. I mean, if you want to add some more information to your page with other links and other examples, I'm sure people would love to come back to Appetik and see some of that and continue the conversation after the time we've had here. So again, thanks again, Brad, and everyone. I'll be back next month with someone else sharing some great ideas. So thank you. Thanks again, Brad. We'll talk to you all later.
All the best. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.